Bob, can you hear me?
I can, James. It's nice to see you.
Oh, well, very nice to see you too. Listen, for us here, it's such a pleasure to be able to give you a warm welcome and thank you for being with us. We're incredibly fortunate to have you because not only because you're a very good friend, but also you're a statesman with international standing. You've had an exceptional career in so many ways, domains of politics, business, academia. I would say truly a man for all seasons. As I recall, we first met when you came to Annapolis in 1990 to deliver a speech on transatlantic relations, asking whether the EU would be internal-looking, itinerant, or international in outlook. That was a long time ago, but it poses interesting questions. You were working with James Baker very closely, leading the US delegation to the 2+4 talks at the time of German unification. And in his book, I looked up The Politics of Diplomacy. You were one of his inner circle who combined Midwest common sense with political sophistication, adding that you were a superb manager, policy analyst, and writer. Your political career has taken you to the USTR from 2001 to 2005. Among other achievements, during this period, China was brought into the WTO, and you developed the strategy for launching the Doha round. I remember visiting you in your office opposite the White House, and on learning that coffee would be a good idea, you simply took us out in your shirt sleeves up the road to the Starbucks on the corner and to have our discussions there. That was a novel event for me. Anyway, looking later on when you became president of the World Bank in 2007, one notable commentary was that you were the quiet revolutionary, driving remarkable change, adapting to the new world that globalization created. A visit to your office, I remember, prompted me to realize your keen interest in saving the tiger, an interesting byproduct of being president of the World Bank. But after leaving the bank, you took up the position as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. As today, you bring together academic prowess with remarkable business acumen, publishing a major work just recently on America in the World, a history of US diplomacy and foreign policy. But you know, through all these positions, the one recurring feeling that I have had is that it is a friendship that matters most, and so it is today. And so now asking you to introduce our subject of the Biden foreign policy challenges and opportunities, I think it's important for those listening in to know that you've always had the honesty to say what you think clearly, and none more so than in March 2016, when you signed an open letter in which top national security leaders outlined their reasons not to support a ticket headed by Donald Trump. In August, you also signed a follow-up letter calling Trump a national security risk. And I don't think I'll quote what you said in November on the radio about whether he would be suitable for the task. I think you proved right. So, Bob, over to you, please. We're really looking forward to your intervention. And over to you.
Well, thanks, James. And it's a real pleasure. And you'll be amused to know that my former colleague from the commission in those days, Pascal Lamy, and I took part in a session just yesterday that the London School of Economics has launched to look at Britain's future economic diplomacy. So while we're looking at the European Union, I still have an ongoing interest in your home country. I really appreciate this invitation in particular because I want to try to encourage the initiative that all of you have taken to look across EU institutions and develop a possible European strategy. And I want to compliment the energetic efforts of Vice President Morris Sasafi. I probably butchered his pronunciation. But also Anthony and the support you've given from the EPRS. And of course, it's a delight to be with you as a long-term friend, James. So today, to get us going, I wanted to offer 4 observations about the possible future Biden foreign policy. First, somewhat contrary to many of the impressions that I see from the European press, U.S. public opinion actually seems supportive of international engagement. And here, I want to point to a recent survey done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The data is quite significant. It reports a bipartisan 68% favor an active part for the United States in world affairs. That's a little higher than during the Cold War. 68% also prefer a shared leadership role, compared with only 24% that prefer U.S. dominance. 2/3 believes that globalization benefits the U.S. Nearly 3/4 believe that trade is good for the U.S. economy. 82% recognize its benefit for U.S. consumers, and even 59% believe it creates jobs at home. Support for NATO is at 73%. 71% believe the U.S. should consult with major allies before making decisions, even if Washington needs to agree with policies that aren't its first choice. So what's wrong? Well, I think Americans, like Europeans and others around the world, focus principally on problems at home. And of course, elected leaders have to shape what's an inchoate public opinion. There's a little useful reminder of this from history. You were kind enough to mention my book, James. You'll see within it, in October 1945, so that's 1 month after Japan's surrender in World War II, Gallup did a poll about priorities. Only 7% of Americans considered international affairs vitally important to the United States. That's in October 1945. Now, in 1946, after the devastation of Europe became more apparent, tensions with the Soviet Union were rising, that number rose all the way up to 14%. So Truman and Marshall and Atchison and Senator Vandenberg and others had a lot of work to do, as any elected leader would, whether in Europe or the United States or any other country. Second, as I think you're probably aware, but just to emphasize it, President-elect Biden faces a very long list of domestic challenges. He's got to deal with pandemic and future biological security, an inclusive economic recovery, immigration issues, climate and the environment, and racial divisions. And as all of you know, in the US system, especially with divided powers, President Biden will have to spend a lot of time with both the Congress and managing what is a very diverse constituency across his own party. Third, nevertheless, I believe there's an opportunity for the Biden administration to leverage its domestic agenda internationally. And I think this offers a special opportunity for relations between the United States and the EU and UK. Recall the advice that my former boss, Baker, gave to Ronald Reagan when Baker was chief of staff in 1981. He said, "Mr. President, you have 3 priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery." Well, today, the priorities are going to be pandemic and economic recovery. There's an important international complement to that. Beyond rejoining the WHO, I think the United States could work with its European partners to push and support the development banks, including the World Bank, to try to work with the WHO on vaccines and treatment with developing countries. The WHO really doesn't have this capacity. It needs the support in terms of logistics, cold storage, working with public healthcare systems, community healthcare systems. The U.S. might even look to the initiative that President Bush 43 took when he launched the HIV/AIDS program primarily for sub-Saharan Africa, which was a game changer in terms of that epidemic for people, particularly in Africa, but other areas. He did something similar for malaria and tuberculosis. And I also think it would be important to look to future biological security issues. This hasn't gotten as much attention, although virologists are well aware of it. The rate of new disease events is rising in frequency and in economic costs. And this is a direct function of land use patterns and changes in the wildlife, livestock, and human contact with the viral spillover. You see this especially in Asia, but there's other regions of the world as well. The world's going to need early detection. It's going to need national response capacity, and it's going to have global preparedness. Let me just give you one very practical example. One of the virologists with whom I work estimates there's about 1.67 million unknown viruses in 24 viral categories, families for mammals and water birds. And he estimated that perhaps 640,000 to some 840,000 have zoonotic potential, so the ability to jump to humans. And he estimates that for $1.2 billion, we could actually discover 71% of these viruses. That might be a very wise investment going forward. Now, there's similar connections between the domestic and international policies for climate change. I hope the Biden administration returns to an idea that President Bush 43 launched late in his term, which is the focus on the big economies. As Europeans are probably aware, about 80 to 90% of the carbon is produced by 10 or 12 economies. If you can get those economies to really push on this issue, you make a huge effect. However, I also think it's very important to draw on the developing world in this process as a sense of sort of common interest and security. An approach that I suggested at the World Bank and worked with Mexico on its COP was what we call the building block approach. So for example, to work with sub-Saharan African countries on soil carbon practices that could be quite significant in absorbing carbon, but would also be a big plus for African agriculture. And you can imagine other initiatives on forestation or avoided deforestation, adaptation issues, which obviously for island states is critically important, energy efficiency, technologically diffusion, and innovation. Of course, there's an aspect about this, about the nature of the international economic recovery too, including for developing economies. Because if they can't develop, Europe and the United States are going to face a different transnational challenge, and that's migration. Now, there's also the challenging topic of data, information technology, cybersecurity, and a host of other issues. I would put a guess that the Biden administration might want to have an initiative among democracies. People have talked about it as a T10 or a T12 to try to frame a common approach on some of these technology issues. Now, it'll be important to differentiate. There's some issues that are fundamental to security: cybersecurity, export controls, 5G systems. But as Europeans are well aware, even within Europe or within North America, there's a big debate on other issues about privacy and data ownership and the ability to have control of your data, issues of platform responsibilities, competition policies, data localization. And frankly, I think European and US and other societies are going to be in the process of working these out. But the question is, can you develop a framework, as one often does in the trade area, where you have some common guidelines but allow countries to proceed in way that suit their own domestic politics? Now, if you step back from what I've just mentioned, you can see that the transnational agenda connects both the domestic concerns with interests of key allies. So this agenda would strike me as being one the administration could use with Europeans as well as people in the Indo-Pacific. And it could provide a foundation for revising, in some ways rebuilding transatlantic ties. Now, I believe you also have to pay close attention to the traditional security issues: nuclear proliferation, regional conflicts, Russia's efforts to revise its borders, cyber and hybrid concerns, terrorism and legal orders, as we're seeing in France and Europe these days. But I think this could add a foundation for relationships with Europe and with key partners across the Pacific to face what will be the two biggest issues for all of us, and that is the future of free societies and the rise of China. Now, fourth and finally, returning to the United States, Europeans will probably ask, can the Biden administration and Congress cooperate sufficiently to support a changing international agenda? And here I'll relate back to some of my own personal experience. In some ways, the situation reminds me of Reagan's second term when I was at the Treasury Department, or under Bush 41, when the Congress was controlled totally by the opposition party. And you also saw this in the later Clinton years. And what you see is that if an executive branch wants to be effective in getting things done, build personal ties, it has to accept some of the opposition's ideas. Sometimes it can take them and rework them into cross-party ideas, and you have to learn how to compromise. And just to give you a feel, when people say this is impossible to do, we had a very broad-based tax reform in 1986 that was a bipartisan effort. We had the Americans for Disabilities Act, which has had a huge effect on an important part of our society. We had very important amendments to the Clean Air Act. We had big budget deals. We had welfare reform, NAFTA, the Uruguay round. And I think the reason people have turned away from this is two. One, I think President Obama's experience actually in the Senate was somewhat limited. He was pretty much running for president for day one. And I'm not sure that he ever really grasped the psychology of this opposition party. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. You just have to understand where the other person's coming from and some of their red lines. I actually think, in contrast, President-elect Biden has a much greater experience and understanding of doing this. So I actually wrote a piece in the past week for the Washington Post where I identified bipartisan co-sponsors of bills dealing with science and technology, foreign assistance, cybersecurity, defense areas. I think the Republicans could also be of help on trade, but that'll be a political challenge for a Biden administration. An entrepreneurial U.S. trade representative might be able to start to rebuild a new trade coalition in the United States. What you see in the polling data is Democratic voters are now more pro-trade than Republican voters, but the traditional Democratic constituencies, particularly with unions, are more on the protectionist side. Frankly, this makes sense. A lot of the younger Democratic voters are connected to the international society. I suspect some of their opinions are just sort of related to hostility to Trump. But you could imagine, for example, an agenda that focuses on some of the data issues, the climate and environmental topics, making sure that you don't have restrictions on exports of healthcare goods. And interestingly enough, whether one can expand the labor agenda. And this will be tricky in different countries. It actually should be less difficult, I would think, with the UK and with Europe. Now, on the Republican side, frankly, some, particularly in the Senate, want to get some things done. Some of them will be up for re-election in 2022. And a smart Biden administration could court some of the independent-minded ones, but there's always a question mark, because traditionally opposition parties are stronger if they can try to hold together. And the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, will clearly follow that path. But Senator McConnell's also been a deal maker with Biden in the past. So to close, I actually think there's some interesting opportunities here for new U.S. administration with both the European Union and with the UK. One has to recognize, however, that a new U.S. administration has to manage some very careful balances, not only the domestic and the international, but this transnational agenda that I've mentioned also has to be connected with what's a rising view about great power competition, particularly with China. So I would like to believe over the longer term that Europe and the United States have bedrock commitment to free societies, and that will offer a vital foundation to work on these issues, even if people are going to disagree and debate about particulars. And so as part of that, again, I just want to close by complimenting this effort about developing a greater strategic sense for the European Union. I think that would actually make a better partner for North America, even though there will, of course, always be differences. And it's important for Europe to recognize after the Trump administration that has to take care of some security issues and has to be understanding that the U.S. policies might also adapt and change. But nevertheless, my sense is that historically, if partners start with a basic similar outlook about society and values, they have some similar views about the challenges of security, that if they bring different perspectives, the ultimate product turns out to be better.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's a wonderful panorama that you've given us, a tour de force as usual. I have just one or two questions, if I might, to lead on the debate from what you've said. In reading some aspects of your book about history and things, which I know you know so much more, particularly in the American context, than I do, but I picked up you had a kind of theory that presidents tend to have continuity, whether they happen to be from a Republican or a Democrat, so taking it back from Bush 1 or whatever. So I understood that you were thinking the process is continuous. Is this going to be a feature, do you think, of President Biden? Will there be things which he will continue to implement as part of policy, maybe on China, I don't know, but other areas where you think that this continuity will actually be there as a principle?
Well, the Trump administration was the exception that proves the rule. So Trump was quite discontinuous. And people are well aware he had a very transactional style, which undermined connections with systems and institutions, particularly for the European Union, which is built on a legal structure and institutional structure. This was highly discordant. He also, his domestic and international agendas were also interlinked. If you think about it, he was trying to demonstrate to his core constituency that he was a disruptor. And so his anti-immigration policies fit very much with, say, the wall with Mexico. And his trade policies of protectionism sort of fit with his sort of economic view the United States had been taken advantage of. And more broadly, he basically wanted to be different from his predecessors. So if Obama did a deal with Iran, he wanted to pull out of it. If Republicans and Democrats didn't do a deal with North Korea, he wanted to go meet Kim Jong-un. Now, there are some, if you think about the Biden administration, I think the biggest difference will be in the area that I highlighted on the transnational issues, whether biological security, sort of climate issues, immigration topics. But you highlighted one that will certainly be that there's a bipartisan concern in the United States for China. And frankly, I think the Trump approach basically was to focus on the bilateral trade deficit, which I think was a narrow, non-sensible approach. And as it turned out, after 4 years, he didn't change the deficit one iota anyway. And his first phase trade deal has not been a success. It's only been about 50% accomplished. As you know, it was a managed trade purchase deal. It wasn't sort of a rules-based deal. But with the spread of COVID-19, he and his administration shift to a full-fledged confrontation. And frankly, I think the relationship came into free fall, and I'm not clear where the bottom is, and it's quite dangerous. Having said that, there's a concern across the American public opinion, and you see this in general public polls as well, that China's economic openness and for the business community was not done in a reciprocal fair way. There was a sense of frustration about human rights issues. There's a concern about China's security efforts. There's no doubt that Xi Jinping took approach of trying to strengthen the hold of the Communist Party. One of my little anecdotes on this that might appeal to a European audience is that Xi created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union when he took office in 2012. And he ordered all the party cadres to see the film. Well, if we had such a film in Europe, Gorbachev would have been the hero that helped end the Cold War. The Chinese version's a little different. Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned the Communist Party, led to the breakup of his country, economic ruin, and the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. And it is interesting, for Europeans and Americans, the end of the Cold War is a historical event. In China, it still casts a long shadow over policy. So I frankly think, both sides have sort of veered off. I suspect, but it's just a suspicion, the Biden administration will want to find some off-ramps. But they have to be careful in doing so and not seen as just conceding to China. You can't go back to the old days. And there are legitimate concerns. My guess is you can find some of those off-ramps in some of the areas that I've mentioned. So for example, if you're going to deal with biological security questions and future pandemics, you're going to have some cooperative relationship with China. And this is a question of, can all parties make the WHO work more effectively, including it without trying to put China in the dock to understand sort of the cause of these problems. And these viral issues that I mentioned are not just China, but they're heavily in Southeast Asia. Climate change issues. Again, you're going to have to get China not only to make a commitment about 2060, but what will it do along the way in terms of coal plants, electrification. Interestingly, you're seeing, this is a good example of where the devil's in the details. In the US and Europe, you're getting some innovative technologies about alternative energies, but to get them to scale, you'll probably have to develop them in the Chinese market. So can there be win-win possibilities there? I think so. Or take one in the development field. People are well aware that many developing countries, particularly in Africa, are going to deal with challenges of debt restructuring. China suggested it's willing to restructure the Exim Bank debt, but not necessarily the China Development Bank debt, which it treats as a commercial lender. The US has been reluctant to support additional SDR allocation. You know, maybe there's a win-win possibility there. And what I'm trying to suggest on this is that you could actually use some of the multilateral structures to kind of diffuse and get some deeper degree of cooperation. And then this is again where the US-EU cooperation will be very important. I'm not a believer in managed trade. I do think that you can negotiate a number of these issues with China. And take intellectual property rights. China's created a series of intellectual property rights courts that now fine for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time. But the penalties aren't high enough. So we should be negotiating higher penalties. In the area of forced technology transfer, that's clearly prohibited by the WTO accession, but many companies are afraid to bring the evidence. So frankly, I'd focus on reducing a lot of the joint venture requirements, which becomes the temptation on this. And just to give you a wonderful example is that, my friend Pascal Lamy had encouraged the creation of a European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing about 20 years ago. I was just on a call, I think a week or so ago, with Jörg Wuttke, who is the chair of that from BASF. And the work done by that European Chamber in Beijing is superb. They're going to have a new report sort of coming out on some of the decoupling issues, I think, next year. But it's a good example of where, frankly, US and Europe have a lot more in common on these issues than they do in terms of conflict. And I believe that if we work together with other parties, we can demonstrate that this is not only a mistake for China to go in the direction of trying to have an economic system that conflicts with the international rules, but it can also be in their self-interest.
Well, this is a very fascinating panorama that you've given us, Bob, because there, in terms of cooperation on post-pandemic economic recovery, on climate change, on the data digital area, and now on China, four major areas where it would seem to be, if you're looking from the outside at the American policy and European policy, these are the four priorities. Sorry, there should only be three if I'm talking with you, because I know that you think there really should be three priorities. But let's leave the pandemic aside and we look at the agenda of climate change, digital transformation. In China, those are the three top things, I think, which would normally come from a European perspective. The question that I have for you is that given that there's this rather large understanding and commonality of partnership in the 2020s, how does it work? How does one get all the players together? Because as you know, the basis for this is the New Transatlantic Agenda of 1995, which most people have never heard of. It seems to have disappeared into history. We haven't had an EU-US summit for about a decade because Obama didn't conduct them. And then, of course, Trump wouldn't wish to go anywhere near that. This is a question I have for myself because, if you're trying to find ways in which the coalitions can get together and actually do something, you do actually need a motivational agenda of some kind. You have the NATO structure. They're looking at NATO 2030. Perhaps the EU-US should look at that transatlantic partnership 2030. What do you think? Because, you have so much experience of these structures, but you need somehow to get this joint agenda off the ground, don't you?
I think, James, the key is to look at this in a networked fashion as opposed to simply a bilateral or a hierarchical fashion. And let me expand on that. When I mentioned issues of dealing with the pandemic, there are questions about the WHO's capacity, and even within that, of course, the connections with the private sector. So it was interesting, while the US pulls out of the WHO, the second biggest funder we learn is the Gates Foundation, right? And of course, the question is, private companies, vaccines, universities, how they're going to contribute. As I mentioned, to deal with this in the developing world, you're also going to need to intersect with the public healthcare systems in those countries. And probably the development institutions are the best sort of partners in that process. You can create supplementary groups, as I mentioned, that the Bush administration did with the PEPFAR program for HIV/AIDS. There's even a dimension of this, of course, in the trade side. So as you try to think about the future of the WTO, maybe to get some initial successes on the board, what about an agreement, not to have export bans on healthcare products, as we saw early in the pandemic? And similarly in the climate sphere, you've got the UNFCCC, but as I always tried to encourage, it needs the members, it needs nation states, but it also can be supported by the international financial institutions. When I was at the World Bank, with the help of many European countries, we raised about $9 billion for climate funds, which we leveraged into about $70 billion. And they were done in different ways to create pilots to sort of explore different ways of financing for developing countries. My point is that I think the way to sort of build cooperation, James, is to do things, is to have results. Success breeds success, right? And so I think where sometimes I think Americans will have a slightly perspective than Europe, because the history of the European Union is creating this structure, and it's a structure still in the process of creation, as this very exercise demonstrates. And you have a changing role of the Commission, changing role of the Parliament, changing role of the member states. And at least as an outsider, to hold all that together, what many people outside Europe didn't fully appreciate is there's kind of it's a very much a legalized structure. It's a legal order and rule structure. I think this is what led to complications in the case of Britain in terms of the Brexit. It kind of thought, well, we can have flexibility here, flexibility to negotiate this and that. It just isn't, as a lot of this, my lesson came from my friend Pascal Lamy, is that it wouldn't work that way into the European system. Now, as you know, there's play in the joints on some of these issues. Now, it also means that there's certain people who understand kind of how these interconnect. So just to, given the topics that I mentioned, my former colleague at the World Bank, Kristalina Georgieva, who then goes on to become a very successful European commissioner, knows the European system, comes back to the World Bank and sort of really is the de facto person running it. And then it goes to the IMF. And so, that's a wonderful connection of somebody who could connect some of the dots on some of these issues. And so, you could have summit meetings, you can have gatherings, and those kind of create an overall tone. But even as I've recommended to some of my American colleagues, what you want to try to do is have actual steps. They don't have to be earth-shaking steps at a time, but sort of demonstrate a direction on these topics. And the one thing I would add to your list, James, is that I think this is maybe assumed, but I think it's important. It's not only the question of dealing with the rise of China, it's a question of the future of free societies, including our own societies. I mean, you're dealing with this right now in your European debate in terms of the financial program and trying to move that through the final stages with the rule of law. We have had movements in all our societies that kind of emphasize fringe, sometimes anti-democratic processes. We can't take free societies for granted. And there's issues about information and availability, different debates. So at heart, the US and Europe have got to be the key access about free societies. I believe others, Canada, Australia, Japan, others will be part of this. But we shouldn't lose sight that at the end of the day, that's probably the fundamental cornerstone.
I think that is a very fair assumption, but it has to be step by step, and you have to show results, because that's always what's going to attract success breeds success. But if we're looking towards 2030, it seems to me that, at least from the evidence in the 2030 research we've done in ESPAS over the last decade, the power of China to become the world's largest economic power seems to be a really overpowering kind of destination which one's looking at. You've touched on that. How can one get off the ground the evolution of a common strategy between the EU, US, and China? because it is such a complex thing involving so many different issues. I think that there's a political willingness to do something because we've seen in Europe in the last 9 months a significant shift since the beginning of the pandemic about attitudes to China. But obviously, there's this question of strategic autonomy and questions of digital sovereignty and other things which come into this evolving debate, which we've been having in the last day and a half. But do you have any advice on that?
Well, as I said with the account of Xi, one has to recognize the changes in China and what you're dealing with in China. And I'll give you another little anecdote, since sometimes it's the best way to remember. I got to know Xi when he was party secretary in Hangzhou. He visited me at the State Department. I later visited him when I was out of government in Hangzhou. I had a number of sessions with him. And as some of the call know, when I was at the World Bank, I did a lot of work on China's future reform. We did a progress with Liu Hu and the process with the Liu Hu and the DRC about a China 2030 report. So when Xi took office, I was with him in a small meeting. I didn't have a chance to ask too many questions, but one of them I asked, so what's your top development priority? Because he knew that I was pretty familiar with their agenda. And he said, the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And I remember because the numbers were transverse. And today I think it's like 88 or 89. Now, I dealt with a lot of presidents and prime ministers over decades. If I'd asked them their development strategy, I don't think any of them would have said, well, my party membership. But that was somewhat revealing of the direction of this. Now, having said that, where I'm a bit of a contrarian in my own country is that there's a new conventional wisdom that's crept in that cooperation with China failed. And this is just flat wrong historically. So just to give you a little sense of this, you know, there was a point where China was an outright enemy. We fought them in Korea. They were sponsoring revolutions and backed proxies in North Korea and North Vietnam. You know, until the late 1980s, China was one of the world's leading proliferators of nuclear weapons and missiles. This started to change in the 90s. They started to join the international conventions. They kept their commitments. They stopped proliferation. You know, how are you going to deal with Iran and North Korea if you don't sort of work with China? Between 2000 and 2018, China supported 182 of 190 UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions that the U.S. sought. Now, sometimes these are slightly watered down, but it's not a record of total failure. China is the second largest supplier of UN peacekeeping. They certainly helped me when I was dealing with genocide in Darfur, as my European partners did. They were the largest contributor to global economic growth. They cut their current account global surplus from 10% to zero, boosting global demand. For 15 years, they were the fastest growing export destination for US exports until Trump. They stopped undervaluing their exchange rate, the largest and quickest stimulus in the global financial crisis. Very good support for the IMF and World Bank. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has actually sort of tried to follow international norms. And even in areas like climate and environment, they have a long way to go, but you can see the leading innovation. In the WTO, which is much debated, one has to recognize their commitments in 2001 were much greater than India, Brazil, and others. And by and large, on the numerical side, they followed the obligations. The record was more problematic where it's harder to measure, like intellectual property rights. Now, my point about this is not that all is well. My point is that the work of diplomacy never stops. And of course, I think there are changes in the system under Xi. But I do believe that if you approach this with the idea that you can't find points of mutual interest with China, you're going to doom yourself. And so what it goes back to really is the whole heart of this strategy we're discussing here. I think the US and the EU will be more successful in nudging China on all these issues, including the economic agenda, if they work together and if they also work together with Japan, Australia, and other parties. You know, there are technocrats in China that recognize, say today, they're expanding their asset management market because they realize they need deeper, more liquid capital markets. Having said that, I think COVID and the Trump administration experience will lead China to become more self-sufficient. You're going to see that in the next sort of 5-year plan. But China realizes it also has to connect sort of internationally. So again, I keep drawing it to the practical, James, and let me give you one other example. I was invited to the China Development Forum for the 40th anniversary of the launch of their forums. And I gave a speech, and one of the parts of the speech, I talked about Belt and Road. And because I worked with China pretty well, I can be pretty frank but respectful to them. And I said, look, no one knows what this is. Is it a development plan? Is it a geopolitical venture? Is it to use excess capacity? I said, it's probably all of these. And then I drew a comparison with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I said, people ask questions about it, but you appointed someone who frankly hired a lot of my former colleagues at the World Bank, and they put in rules on transparency and procurement and governance and environmental topics. I said, why don't you apply those same principles to Belt and Road? Well, frankly, one of the leading Chinese officials said, look, we've given your speech to Xi. The next year, Xi gives a speech at the Belt and Road Forum, and it had a lot of echoes of my speech. However, this is the problem. What should have happened at that point was that Europe, the US, Japan, others should have followed up and said, this is great. This is a very important step. How do we make sure we monitor it? How do we track it? How do we know that you're doing these things? And so, this is the devil of the details of diplomacy, James, is that, can the United States, Europe, and others focus on some of these common topics of interest, and not in a hostile way with China, but basically say, if you don't do these things, frankly, we're going to have to take alternative actions. And the one that's going to be on the agenda right now is the state-owned enterprises. And Europe has a lot of experience of this with state aid provisions.
Oh, but I have a question just to end off our wonderful conversation here. And that's on your major book that you just released. I think you would expect me at least to give you a moment to be able to say a word about this, on the history of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy. I read somewhere that this was a kind of counterpoint to Henry Kissinger's diplomacy, which was seen more from a European perspective, and this is actually from an American perspective. But tell us a little bit of why it came about and how you put it all together, because it is really a magnum opus.
Well, thank you. Well, in some ways, you might say it's a counterpoint. In some ways, it's a compliment. And the context was that when I was working on foreign policy issues, I often thought it was important to have a historical perspective. So I'm quite interested in how you can apply history to policy making. And one of the reasons I wrote this was to encourage younger generations to also think in these terms. And I don't know how it is in Europe, but many foreign policy courses taught in the United States now focuses on international relations theory. And it's all intellectually fun to debate. However, it didn't seem too applicable to me when I was dealing with German unification or Darfur, or the WTO, World Bank, or trade issues. Kissinger wrote his diplomacy in the 90s, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. And it's a very wonderful book. Not surprisingly, knowing Henry Kissinger, it tends to reflect more a European realpolitik perspective. So it's European in the sense of old Europe as opposed to necessarily at least the European Union model. And so I wanted to try to do something that brought in some of the American experience and ideas. And so the model that I took to make it more readable was I focus on stories about people and particular episodes. And so in some ways it's a multiple biography. And the logic is I try to meet a true historian's test of seriousness about the facts and kind of what happened at the time. But then I add my own assessments, and I try to, in a sense, encourage people to think about these as problem-solving ventures, because that's a lot of what sort of my experience has been. And I suppose the one other dimension of this is that in many of my posts, James, I would often ask my younger colleagues about history because they had no idea what they learned. And I sort of tortured them, I guess, with questions. And insofar as they did know history, in the case of the US, it was tended to be from 1945 on. And there's a rich experience in the first 150 years. And by the way, during many of these years, the United States didn't have domain dominance, so you had to play a weak or moderate hand. There's a lesson of diplomacy in that process as well. And I suppose one other aspect that Europeans might appreciate is that it often helps to know a little bit about the history of other people. I found if you know enough simply to ask questions, it puts you in a great advantage. And if you're from Europe or the United States, often people around the world sort of appreciate that you would have the respect to know about their own country. So I look upon history not so much for great analogies, which can be misleading, but kind of questions to ask in the process. So thanks for suggesting it. It's a readable book. If you start it with Ben Franklin, it'll carry you forward.
That's exactly the example that I was thinking of. It starts off with Franklin and how he changes and all the contacts that he had in the 1770s. It's really a fascinating read. So, Bob, I think it's now our time has come to an end on this interview. So thank you so very much for being with us. I think it's been extraordinarily illuminating, and we will have a lot to think about as we now carry the process of ESPAS forward in the months ahead. I look forward to seeing you shortly. All the very best.
All best. Thank you.
Thank you.